In this lesson, we're going to discuss cations and anions. First, let's look at some definitions of some terms. When we have an ion, then we have a charged particle. A cation is a positively charged particle. One way to help you remember this is thinking about positive. Cations are positive because cats have paws. An anion is a negatively charged particle. First, we'll look at monatomic ions. In a later lesson, we'll look at something called polyatomic ions. But let's break down this term. Mono means one, atomic means atom, and ion means it has a charge. So these are single atoms that form an ion. We see both cations with a positive charge and anions with a negative charge. We can have a variety of charges. So +1, +2, +3 are shown here. We see -1 and -2, but we could also have -3 depending on the atom, and we'll talk more about how we predict that later. We have positively charged cations and then negatively charged anions. Which one is a cation? Remember that cation means it has a positive charge, therefore Ca2 plus or calcium 2 plus is our cation. O2 minus would be an anion, and N is a neutral atom. When cations form, they do so through the loss of electrons. So this is really important to remember. It's always the loss of electrons. Let's look at an example with beryllium and beryllium 2 plus. If I look at the number of protons, we see that they both have 4 protons because that's the atomic number for beryllium. If I change the number of protons, I'm no longer dealing with beryllium. We're given the mass number here, so we can determine that both of these have 5 neutrons because the number of protons plus neutrons equals the mass number. And for electrons, we know that beryllium, the neutral species, has 4 electrons because we need 4 protons and 4 electrons because those numbers have to be equal to have a neutral species. When we look at beryllium 2 plus, what we see that it only has 2 electrons. It has lost 2 electrons because we have more protons than electrons. Therefore, we have a positively charged species. We only change the number of electrons when we're forming ions. How many electrons are lost when aluminum forms Al3 plus? 3 plus means that there are 3 more protons than electrons. If I look at aluminum, it has 13 protons and 13 electrons. If I look at aluminum 3 plus, it also has 13 protons because that is based on the identity of the element. Protons are not going to change when we form ions. Now, I need to figure out the number of electrons, and we know we have 3 more protons than electrons, so we have 10 electrons. So 3 is the correct answer. Anions form through the gain of electrons. Let's look at an example with chlorine. So both chlorine and chlorine minus, which is a -1 charge because there's no number there, have 17 protons. They also both have 18 neutrons because we have the mass number and we know protons plus neutrons equals the mass number. For electrons, in the neutral species, the number of protons equals the number of electrons. For chlorine minus, or the chlorine ion, we see that we have to gain electrons, and we're going to gain 1 electron to get to the -1 charge. So we're going to have 18 electrons. Negatively charged, therefore we have to have more electrons than protons. How many electrons are gained when S forms S2 minus? Let's look at each species and look at the number of protons and electrons. The atomic number of sulfur is 16, so we see that both S and S2 minus have 16 protons. We look at S, that's neutral, it also has 16 electrons. Remember, we need to gain electrons so that we have more electrons than protons, So we need to gain 2 electrons to get 18 electrons with 16 protons. Therefore, we have a 2 minus charge. Therefore, we have 2 more electrons than protons, and we've gained 2 electrons to form the S2 minus ion. Which statement is true? We can eliminate options C and D because they're both talking about the gain and loss of protons. The number of protons does not change when forming an ion. The number of protons determines the identity of the element, not the charge. Therefore, when we look at cations forming from the loss of electrons, this would result in more protons than electrons. Therefore, we'd have a positively charged species. So that is our correct answer. If I want to correct the second statement, I need to say that anions form from the gain of electrons.